My daughter-in-law redecorated my living room while I was at my Tuesday card game. I came home to find my mother's rocking chair, the one with the hand-carved roses on the armrests, the one my father made for her the year I was born, sitting on the porch, just sitting there in the November cold like it was nothing, like it was a piece of junk waiting for trash day. I stood in the driveway for a long moment. I didn't go inside right away. I just looked at that chair. That was the day I knew. I want to back up, though, because this story didn't start there. It started the way most things start, slowly, quietly, in a way you don't notice until you're already standing in the middle of it, wondering how you got there. My husband and I built our home in Charlottesville, Virginia in 1987. Not built it literally, we weren't contractors, but we built it the way couples do. We found the lot. We scraped together the down payment. We argued over floor plans on the kitchen table with cold coffee and a flashlight when the power went out during an ice storm. We chose the paint colors, the cabinet hardware, the exact shade of cream for the trim that took 4 sample pots to get right. We planted the dogwood tree in the front yard the spring our son was born. My husband passed 7 years ago. Heart attack, very sudden, the kind that doesn't give you time to prepare. He was 64. He'd been planning to retire the following spring. We had talked about taking the train to Portland to visit his brother. We had talked about a lot of things. After he was gone, it was just me in the house, 2,200 square feet for one person. My son, he lives about 40 minutes away in Waynesboro, started calling more often, which I appreciated. Then, about 2 years after my husband passed, he and his wife came over for Sunday dinner and sat down across from me at the table and said they had been thinking. Their apartment lease was ending. The rent had gone up again. They were hoping to start a family soon and needed more space. Would I consider letting them move in? I want to be clear about one thing, I offered. I said yes before they even finished asking. That house had 4 bedrooms. I was rattling around in it alone, eating soup out of the can some nights because it didn't feel worth it to cook for one. The idea of having my son nearby, of hearing another person's footsteps in the hallway in the morning, I wanted that. I genuinely wanted it. We sat down together and worked out an arrangement. They would pay me $600 a month, which was well below what a room in that area was renting for. And they would help with utilities and yard work. I had paid off the mortgage 11 years earlier, so $600 was really just to make them feel like they were contributing. I would have let them stay for free. My son took the master bedroom at the end of the hall. His old room was too small for a couple, and I moved into the guest room. I told myself I didn't mind. The guest room had a window that looked out over the backyard, and there was a peach tree out there that bloomed every April. I told myself it was a fair trade. For the first 6 months, it was fine. It was better than fine. My daughter-in-law and I would have coffee together on Saturday mornings. My son would come home from work and we'd eat dinner together 3-4 times a week. It felt like a family again. I hadn't realized how much I had missed that particular sound. A house full of people, someone calling from another room, the TV on in the background. Then things started to shift. It was small at first, the way it always is. My daughter-in-law, I'll call her by her role because honestly that's how I had come to think of her by the end, started reorganizing the kitchen. She put my good casserole dishes on the highest shelf and filled the lower cabinets with things I didn't recognize. I found a box of my mixing bowls in the garage one afternoon. When I asked about it, she said she was trying to maximize space, that my bowls were a mismatched set anyway, that she'd gotten a nice new nesting set that worked better. I said, okay. I put the bowls back in the garage. My son got a promotion around that time and started traveling for work, 3-4 days a week, sometimes longer. And with him gone, the temperature in the house changed. Nothing I could point to exactly. Just to chill. She stopped inviting me to join them when her friends came over. I'd hear them in the living room, laughing, glasses clinking, and I'd stay in my room with the door closed and a book open on my lap, not reading. I told myself they needed their space, that I shouldn't hover. I told myself a lot of things. The television was moved from the living room to the master bedroom. When I asked about it, my daughter-in-law said she thought it would be better for everyone to have separate spaces. I asked about the living room TV. She said she donated it. It was old. My mother's rocking chair had been in the living room for 12 years. My husband had always sat beside it in his armchair and teased me that I was turning into an old woman before my time. I used to sit in that chair to read, to do crosswords, to watch the street go quiet in the evenings. When I came home to find it on the porch in November, something solidified in me. Not anger exactly, more like clarity. I brought the chair inside myself. I put it in my room. 2 weeks later, my son came home from a work trip and asked if he could speak with me after dinner. He sat down at the kitchen table. My kitchen table, the one I'd bought at an estate sale in 1994 and refinished twice, and he looked at the table surface instead of at me. He said he and his wife had been talking. He said things had gotten a little crowded, a little tense. He said they were thinking about starting a family, maybe soon, and they were going to need the space. I waited. He said he thought it might be time for me to look at other options. There was a nice senior living community over in Crozet. They had independent living apartments, a shuttle service, activities. He said he thought I'd really like it once I got settled. I sat across from him and I looked at my hands on the table. I was 67 years old. I was in perfect health. I drove myself everywhere, managed my own finances, grew tomatoes in the backyard every summer. And my son was sitting in my house, telling me about shuttle services and activities. I said I'd think about it. He looked relieved. That was the part that stung the most. He looked relieved. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the guest room of my own house, and I listened to the peach tree branch tap against the window. And I thought about my husband. I thought about the day we signed the papers on this house, how he carried me over the threshold as a joke, how I was 31 years old and so certain about everything. I thought about the 23 years we lived inside these walls, the holidays, the arguments, the ordinary Tuesday evenings that somehow become the things you miss most. I was not going to Crozet. But here's what I understood. Lying there in the dark, I was not going to win an argument about this. My son had already made up his mind. My daughter-in-law had already made up her mind. If I pushed back, I would become the difficult one, the stubborn old woman who wouldn't let the young people live their lives. I had seen that happen to other women. I was not going to let that happen to me. So I made a plan instead. I called my attorney the next morning. Her name is Maureen, and she's been handling my affairs for 15 years. I told her what was happening. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always appreciated about her. When I was done, she said, "Your name is the only name on that deed, correct?" I said yes. She said, "Then you can sell whenever you want to. You don't need anyone's permission. You don't need to tell anyone." I said I understood. I called a realtor that same afternoon, a woman my neighbor had used 2 years earlier. I'd seen the sold sign go up fast, and I'd filed her name away in the back of my mind, the way you file things away without knowing why. She came over on a Thursday morning while my son was at work and my daughter-in-law was at her yoga class. She walked through every room, asked a few questions, took measurements. She said the market in Charlottesville was strong. She thought we could list at 480 and probably close higher. I signed the listing agreement before she left. I want to say something here, because I've thought about it a lot since. I did not feel guilty. People might expect me to say I felt torn, conflicted, that I lay awake second-guessing myself. I didn't. What I felt, sitting at my kitchen table after the realtor left, was something closer to peace. Like I had finally stopped waiting for someone else to decide what my life looked like. The house had 2 showings the first week. My daughter-in-law noticed the realtor's card on the counter during the second one. I had forgotten to put it away, and she asked me about it. I told her I was exploring my options, just as my son had suggested. She seemed satisfied with that. She went back to her yoga mat. We had an offer by day 9. $492,000, conventional financing, 30-day close. I called Maureen. She said it was clean. I said let's accept. I had already found an apartment, a 2-bedroom in a building I loved on a tree-lined street downtown, walking distance from the coffee shop where I used to meet my friend Harriet on Friday mornings before she moved to Savannah. The apartment had original hardwood floors and tall windows and a little balcony where I was already picturing the rosemary planters I would put out in the spring. I paid the deposit the same week I accepted the offer on the house. I arranged the movers for a Wednesday. My son was scheduled to be in Richmond for work through Thursday. My daughter-in-law taught a Pilates class on Wednesday mornings and ran errands in the afternoon. I had a 4-hour window. I took only what was mine: my mother's rocking chair, my husband's armchair, the kitchen table, the photographs, the box of my mother's china that I'd kept wrapped in dish towels in the hall closet for years, my books, the quilt my grandmother made, the garden tools from the shed. I left everything they had brought, every piece of furniture they'd added, every kitchen gadget, everything. I didn't take a single thing that was theirs. I was careful about that. The movers finished in 3.5 hours. I did one last walkthrough alone. I stood in the doorway of the room that had been my son's when he was small, the one with the south-facing window where he used to set up his Lego on the floor on winter afternoons while the sun came through. I stood there for a while. Then I went to the backyard, and I looked at the dogwood tree we planted the year he was born. It was 35 years old now, and you couldn't get your arms around the trunk. I walked out the front door, and I locked it, and I left the keys on the counter. My realtor's office handled the closing. I did not need to be present at the property. I signed my documents at Maureen's office that morning, had lunch at a cafe around the corner, went back to my new apartment, and started unpacking my books. My son called me at 6:15 that evening. I was putting the rocking chair in the corner by the window when my phone rang. He said, "Mom, where are your things?" I said, "I moved, sweetheart. I found a place I really love." There was a long silence. He said, "You sold the house." I said, "I did." Another silence. He said, "You sold the house." I said, "I did." Another silence. Then he said my name. Just my name, the way he used to say it when he was a boy and he'd done something wrong and was trying to figure out how much I already knew. I said, "I know this is a surprise, and I want you to know I did not make this decision out of anger. I made it because it was my house, and I decided what to do with it. You're my son, and I love you very much. I hope you'll find something that works for the two of you, and I hope we can have dinner soon. But I need to go now. I have a lot of unpacking to do." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm really sorry." I believed him. I think he meant it. I think standing in an empty house has a way of clarifying things that years of comfortable assumptions can't. I said, "I know you are. Good night, sweetheart." I hung up and I sat down in my mother's rocking chair, and I looked out at the street below, at the street lights coming on in the early dark of November, at a couple walking a dog past the building, at 2 kids on bikes cutting across the parking lot of the coffee shop. I thought about my husband. I thought about how much he would have had to say about all of this. He had a way of cutting straight to the thing, of finding the sentence that named exactly what was happening when everyone else was dancing around it. I could hear him perfectly, the tone of his voice, the particular amusement he would not quite hide. He would have said, "I told you, never underestimate you." He told me that a lot, actually. I used to roll my eyes. I'm not rolling my eyes anymore. The apartment took about 3 weeks to feel like mine. The first few mornings were strange. New sounds, new light angles, the particular way this building settles in the cold. I made myself go to the coffee shop every Friday morning anyway, even though Harriet wasn't there to meet me. I ordered my usual. I sat by the window. By the 3rd Friday, I had introduced myself to the woman who always took the table next to mine, a retired librarian named Polly who turned out to have an opinion about everything and a laugh you could hear from 2 rooms away. We've been having coffee together every Friday since. My son called again about a week after I moved. He asked if he could come see the apartment. I said yes. He came alone. His wife did not come, and he sat on my couch and looked around at my things arranged in the new space, and I could see him trying to find the right words. He said, "I handled this badly." I said, "Yes." He said, "I shouldn't have. I mean, it was your house. I grew up in that house." I said, "Yes, you did." He said, "I think I convinced myself it made sense, that it was practical, that you'd be happier somewhere smaller." I said, "Did you ask me?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "No." I told him I didn't need an explanation. I told him I needed him to understand that I am not invisible and that I am not done, and that what I do with my life and my property is my decision to make, not his. I told him I love him and I always will, and I also will not be managed. He cried a little, which I hadn't expected. He's not a person who cries easily. We had dinner that evening at the Italian place a few blocks from my apartment. We talked about his father. We talked about the dogwood tree. He told me the new owners have a little girl who's already trying to climb it. I was glad to hear that. Things are still finding their footing between us. It's not the same as it was before all of this, and maybe it won't ever be exactly. But he calls. He comes for dinner. Last month he drove me to my cardiology appointment when my car was in the shop, and we stopped for pie on the way home. My rosemary planters are on the balcony now. They came through the winter better than I expected. I have a life that is entirely my own, in a home that belongs to no one but me. And every morning when I sit in my mother's rocking chair with my coffee and watch the street wake up, I think about how different this looks from the thing I was afraid of. I was afraid of being alone. I was already alone. The difference now is that I chose it. And there is a world of distance between a life you're pushed into and a life you walk into yourself. I've been thinking a lot lately about how we teach people how to treat us, not with words, but with what we allow to continue. For a long time, I allowed it. The rocking chair moved to the porch, the mixing bowls in the garage, the TV donated without a word to me. I told myself it was fine, that they needed space, that I was being generous. What I was actually doing was making myself smaller and smaller until I almost disappeared inside my own home. That's the part nobody talks about. It doesn't happen in one dramatic moment. It happens in dozens of small ones, each one reasonable enough on its own, until one day you're sleeping in the guest room of the house you paid for, and eating dinner alone with a book open on your lap, not reading. What my son did? Suggesting that senior living community in Crozet, that look of relief on his face when I said I'd think about it. That wasn't cruelty. I've had to sit with that. He convinced himself it was practical, that he was helping. That's almost harder to reckon with than outright meanness, because it means the harm came wrapped in something that looked like concern. But here is what I've come to understand. The intention behind an action doesn't cancel out its effect. My son may not have meant to treat me like I was invisible. He did it anyway, and I had a choice about what to do with that. I chose not to argue. Not because I was afraid of the argument, but because I recognized it wouldn't change anything. Some things can't be fixed with a conversation. Some things have to be demonstrated. When I signed those listing papers, when I sat across from Maureen and initialed every page, I wasn't acting out of anger. I was acting out of the clearest thinking I'd done in years. That's what I want people to understand. The wisest moves don't always look wise in the moment. They look quiet. They look almost unremarkable. It's only later, when the dust settles, that you can see what actually happened. Polly, my Friday coffee friend, the retired librarian who laughs too loud and has an opinion about everything, told me recently that she thinks of what I did as a kind of self-education. That somewhere along the way I had learned something most people never quite figure out, which is that dignity isn't something other people give you. It's something you decide to keep. I think that's right. I think that's exactly right. My son is learning too. Slowly, and not without discomfort. His, mostly. But I watch him when he comes for dinner now. The way he looks around the apartment at my things in the new light, and I can see him recalculating. That's growth. Uncomfortable. Inconvenient. Real growth. I'm 67 years old and I am not finished. My rosemary is growing on the balcony. Tom's armchair is in the corner by the window. I have a life that I chose, not one I was maneuvered into. And if someone you love is trying to make your world smaller, please know this. You don't have to fight them. You just have to refuse to shrink.